Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going deep, diving deep into Brené Brown's Dare to Lead. Using those excerpts you sent in, we'll uncover those core lessons about courage and leadership and pull out those really fascinating real-world examples so you can walk away, feeling ready to apply these ideas.
Dare to Lead, it's a practical guide, really, to courageous leadership.
Okay.
Brown, she combines like decades of research with real-world examples and explains how vulnerability and trust and empathy, they aren't weaknesses, but essential parts of effective leadership.
Let's start at the beginning.
Okay.
I found her anecdote about mistaking sea level for sea level. It was hilarious.
Right.
I totally related to that.
It really gets at that vulnerability, Even someone like Brené Brown can have self-doubt and uncertainty.
Right.
It's a good reminder that vulnerability, it's a human thing,
Not a weakness.
Not a weakness, exactly.
And then she ties that vulnerability to the, that famous Theodore Roosevelt quote about the man in the arena.
Absolutely. That quote's all about true daring. It's not about avoiding failure, right? But showing up, being present, even risking getting hurt.
Yeah.
Because it's in the arena, that space where we actually grow and learn.
So then she goes into part one.
Yes.
Rumbling with vulnerability. And she really digs into what vulnerability is and maybe more importantly, what it isn't.
Yeah, Brown debunks those myths about vulnerability that hold us back, as leaders.
Yeah.
For example, that myth that vulnerability is weakness.
Right.
She asks military special forces to give an example of courage without vulnerability, and nobody could.
It makes you realize that vulnerability, it's not the opposite of courage. It's where it comes from.
Exactly. You wouldn't need courage if there were no risk, right?
Right.
Courage is all about facing vulnerability.
Okay. Another myth that really stuck with me was that trust comes before vulnerability. I used to think you had to earn trust first, then you could be vulnerable.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Well, Brown flips that idea completely. I remember the marble jar analogy.
Right. Yeah.
Trust, it's built through small, consistent acts of vulnerability over time. It's those everyday moments, those authentic moments where you're listening, being reliable, that slowly fill the jar.
So that's helpful, right? Because it gives us something we can actually do.
Exactly.
We can start building trust, like today, by being a little more open and honest.
Exactly. Brown emphasizes that it's not just what we say, it's what we do.
Yeah.
Aligning actions with words, showing we can be trusted.
That takes us to part two, living into our values. Brown talks about how important it is to identify our core values and then making sure our actions match those values. She says we only have one set of values, not like work values and personal values.
I think that's such a key point, especially now, when it's so easy to compartmentalize, Brown really emphasizes that true integrity comes from living those values all the time, not just when it's easy.
Right. And she gives us this practical tool for operationalizing values, it's called. And I love the values operationalizinator.
A little quirky, right?
Yes.
But it highlights that we don't just say our values, but we turn them into actual behaviors.
She uses her own example, her core value being courage. For her, courage is speaking up against injustice, even when it's hard.
Right.
And she uses the 8-second rule to remind herself that speaking up is uncomfortable for 8 seconds, but, staying silent, that regret can last way longer.
Oh, yeah. That 8-second rule, it's a powerful reminder that courage is about pushing past discomfort.
Right.
Choosing integrity over just, being comfortable.
Then in part 3, braving trust.
Yes.
Brown dives into the anatomy of trust, right? Breaking it down into 7 elements.
Braving, boundaries, reliability, accountability, vault, integrity, non-judgment, and generosity.
I really struggle with boundaries.
Oh.
How can braving help me build trust, starting with myself?
Well, when you trust yourself to set those boundaries, and keep them, you're showing you're reliable not just to others, but to yourself, too.
Right.
That consistency is key because it shows you're dependable,
Okay.
You respect your own needs as well as the needs of others. Reliability is also about, doing what you say you'll do, being on time, following through.
That makes sense. So how does accountability fit into that?
Accountability, it's about owning your mistakes, apologizing, making amends. When you're accountable for your actions, you show that you can be trusted to take responsibility and learn from mistakes.
Okay, and what about vault? What does that mean?
Vault is all about confidentiality. Can people trust you to keep secrets? Do you share information appropriately while respecting privacy? It's crucial because people need to feel safe sharing vulnerable stuff with you, knowing you won't betray them.
Makes me think about times I've, accidentally broken someone's trust by sharing something they told me in confidence. It's so important to be mindful of that.
It is, absolutely. And this connects to the integrity piece.
Right.
Integrity is about choosing courage over comfort, doing the right thing even when it's hard, and being honest, transparent, in all your interactions.
And non-judgment. That's got to be one of the hardest parts of trust,
That's
right? Both with ourselves and with others.
It is so easy to judge. But Brown argues that real trust, it requires us to practice being non-judgmental. It means creating a space where people can ask for help, admit they don't know something, make mistakes without feeling ashamed.
So we've got to create that safe space.
Yes.
So finally, generosity. What does that look like when we're talking about trust?
Generosity, in this case, it's about assuming the best in others, giving them the benefit of the doubt, being understanding even when they mess up, recognizing that we're all human, we all make mistakes, and we all need a little bit of grace.
It's a good reminder. Sometimes, especially at work, we forget that everyone's doing the best they can.
Absolutely. That's why practicing non-judgment and generosity is so important for building trust.
Yeah.
It helps create a more compassionate and supportive environment where people feel safe taking risks and learning and growing.
So we've covered the first three parts, focusing on vulnerability, values, and trust. What can listeners expect from Part 4, Learning to Rise?
Part 4, Brown digs into building resilience and navigating those moments when we fall. She says true resilience isn't avoiding failure, but learning how to get back up, learn from mistakes and grow through hard times.
What I love about Brown's work is she doesn't shy away from the tough stuff.
Yeah.
The messy parts of life, She acknowledges we're all going to have setbacks, be disappointed, and fail.
And she wants us to embrace those experiences, to learn and grow from them.
Right.
She argues that it's in those moments, when we're down, that we can build resilience, get to know ourselves better, and really build our courage.
So she's not saying, aim to fail.
Yeah.
But, expect to fail sometime and be ready to pick yourself up.
Right. It's a mindset shift. Seeing failure as part of learning, not something to be ashamed of.
This makes me think of growth mindset.
Oh, yeah?
That idea that our abilities, they're not fixed. We can learn and grow through effort.
You got it. Brown's work on resilience, it lines up perfectly with that growth mindset idea. It's about welcoming challenges,
Yeah.
Seeing mistakes as chances to learn and believing we can always get better.
So learning to rise, it's about building inner strength.
Mm-hmm.
That helps us keep going when things are tough.
Exactly. And Brown introduces this cool concept, the story I'm telling myself. She says when we face those challenges, our minds, they create stories, right? Filled with fear, blame, and self-doubt.
Oh, those negative stories, they can be so sneaky. They can really take over if you're not careful.
Absolutely. And Brown emphasizes these stories, they're just stories.
Yeah.
Not always true, but how our minds try to understand and protect us.
So how do we challenge them?
Well, Brown suggests a 3-step process. Reckoning, rumbling, and revolution.
Okay.
The reckoning, it's about recognizing you're hooked by emotion, your reaction is driven by fear, anger, something like that.
That first step is huge.
It is.
I get so caught up in my initial reaction, I don't even realize I'm telling myself a negative story.
It happens to all of us. That's why reckoning is so important. It's about taking a step back, noticing what's happening inside you. Brown wants us to pay attention to our body, our thoughts, our feelings, those early warnings that we're spiraling.
What are some of those early warning signs?
She gives a list of snag feelings, disappointment, regret, anger, hurt, heartbreak, confusion, fear, worry, things like that.
I think we've all felt those at some point.
Oh, for sure. And Brown also encourages us to notice the physical stuff that comes with those emotions.
Like what?
Like your heart racing, shallow breathing, tightness in your chest, a knot in your stomach,
It's about tuning into our bodies, right?
Yes.
Recognizing those signals to pause and check in.
Exactly. And that leads to step 2, the rumble.
Okay, what does it mean to rumble?
The rumble, it's where you dig into that story you're telling yourself. Getting curious about the thoughts, beliefs, assumptions fueling your reaction.
So getting curious about our own thinking.
Right.
Checking if those thoughts are even true or just fear and insecurity.
Exactly. And that's where her idea of the shitty first draft comes in.
Okay.
When we're going through something hard, our minds create these stories, right? Full of blame, self-doubt, worst-case scenarios.
Right.
But those shitty first drafts, They're just drafts.
Okay.
Not always accurate, just our minds trying to make sense and protect us.
So how do we challenge them?
One powerful tool is just naming them. Say, okay, the story I'm telling myself right now is, and then examine it.
Just acknowledging those thoughts can help, right?
It can. Once you name them, you can challenge them. Is this really true? What evidence do I have? Is there another way to look at this?
It's about changing our perspective, focusing on the facts, not our fears.
Exactly. And that takes us to the final step, the revolution.
The revolution sounds intense. What is that?
It's integrating the Rumble learnings into our lives, taking those insights from the Reckoning and Rumble and using them to make changes.
So not a massive change, but small shifts that add up over time.
Exactly. And Brown says it's an ongoing process, not a destination.
Learning to rise, it's not just bouncing back, but using those tough times to grow and change.
Exactly. And one important thing we can do as leaders is to create a culture where this whole process is normal, supported.
It's about creating a space where people feel safe to be vulnerable, make mistakes, challenge things, and learn and grow from those experiences.
Exactly. And Brown says this is essential for building trust and fostering innovation.
This leads us to part 5, the daring way to lead, which explores putting these principles into practice in leadership.
One key idea is armored leadership.
Okay.
Brown describes it as behaviors we use when we feel vulnerable, but actually they create distance.
I've seen that at work. Leaders try to project strength, but they end up pushing people away and creating a culture of fear.
Exactly. Brown identifies different types like perfectionism, numbing, and power over. Perfectionism sets impossible standards, numbing avoids difficult emotions, and power over, dominates instead of collaborates.
Those armored leadership behaviors, I've been guilty of some myself.
Oh, yeah?
Perfectionism, especially. I set high standards and get frustrated when others don't meet them.
It's common, but it can really hurt morale. When we're always striving for perfection, we set everyone up for failure. People become afraid to take risks or ask for help.
So how do we move away from that?
Brown says we embrace vulnerability, build trust, and practice empathy.
Yeah.
When we're willing to be vulnerable, be ourselves, connect, on a human level, we create a supportive environment, a place where people feel safe to take risks, make mistakes, and learn.
So daring leadership is about shifting from fear and control to trust and empowerment.
You got it. And Brown emphasizes this isn't a one-time thing. It's an ongoing practice. Choosing courage over comfort, vulnerability over perfection, connection over being alone.
I love how Brown talks about self-compassion. She says we can't be daring leaders if we're always beating ourselves up.
So true. Self-compassion, it's essential for resilience. It lets us see our flaws without shame. It gives us space to learn from mistakes and move forward with confidence.
One thing I find inspiring about Dare to Lead is how Brown combines her personal stories with her research. It's like this tapestry of vulnerability and courage and resilience that feels relatable and aspirational at the same time.
I know, right?
She's so honest about her struggles, her battle with addiction, her concussion. Those stories make her work so powerful.
It's that vulnerability, sharing those parts of herself, that lets her connect with people so deeply. It reminds us we're all human, we all mess up, it's okay to ask for help. And one thing I appreciate is that Brown says daring leadership isn't about being perfect or knowing everything. It's about showing up authentically, with integrity, and a willingness to learn.
It's about those qualities, vulnerability, courage, empathy, using them to create a better world.
And she gives so many examples of what that looks like,
Right?
Speaking up, having tough conversations, just showing up with compassion.
Speaking of showing up, Brown talks about a learning mindset in ourselves and in the people we lead.
Right, that belief that we can always learn, we can get better, and mistakes, they're chances to grow, not failures.
She even connects it back to raising kids.
Yeah.
She says instead of protecting them from failure, we should teach them to embrace it, learn from it, get back up.
It's not about avoiding those falls, but having the skills to handle them.
This has been a great conversation about the first 5 parts of Dare to Lead. But we're just getting started.
Yeah.
Let's pick up where we left off next time.
Picking up where we left off, part 6 of Dare to Lead, Brown dives into embracing imperfection and letting go of that need for certainty, control.
That really hits home for me because I often catch myself trying to plan for everything, control every outcome. It's exhausting, and it doesn't even work.
It's so common these days, right?
Yeah.
Feeling like we need to have all the answers, be in control all the time. But Brown, she reminds us that true daring is about embracing the uncertainty, imperfection, letting go of control, trusting the process.
How does that work in leadership? How can we be effective leaders and still embrace imperfection?
Brown says it starts with self-compassion. When we can be kind to ourselves, understand ourselves, we create space to learn and grow, and then we can model that same compassion for others, for the people we lead.
Makes sense. You can't build trust and encourage innovation if you're always criticizing right, yourself and everyone else.
Exactly. And Brown emphasizes that embracing imperfection doesn't mean lowering your standards. It's not about accepting mediocrity. Yeah. It's about recognizing that we're human, we'll make mistakes, and it's okay to not have all the answers.
But finding that balance, right?
Yeah.
Striving for excellence, but accepting that we won't always be perfect.
Right. And Brown gives some tips for embracing imperfection at work, like celebrating progress, not just perfection.
Yep.
Encouraging people to experiment, take risks, and creating a safe space to fail.
I love that. Celebrating progress. It's so easy to focus on what's not working, what still needs to be done.
Yeah.
We forget to appreciate how far we've come.
It's huge, right?
Okay.
Celebrating those small wins, it can really motivate a team, give them a sense of moving forward.
Especially when things are tough.
Exactly. It creates a more positive work environment, boosts morale, people get more done.
And Brown also encourages leaders to be vulnerable with their teams.
Yes. Share their struggles, their imperfections, and show that it's okay to not have all the answers.
That's got to be so powerful.
It is. When leaders are vulnerable, it gives others permission to do the same. It breaks down those walls, builds trust and authenticity.
Exactly. And Brown, she's clear that this vulnerability isn't weakness, it's strength.
Right.
It takes courage to show up authentically, admit you're struggling, and ask for help.
It makes me think about Brown's idea of fitting in versus belonging.
Oh, that's a good connection.
Yeah.
She says fitting in is trying to be what others want, while belonging is being yourself.
Right.
And she says real belonging can only happen when we're vulnerable.
So let go of trying to be perfect. Please, everyone, just be yourself.
Exactly. And she argues that this is key for daring leadership. When we try to fit in, we're not really there, We hold back, we censor ourselves.
Right.
But when we belong, when we feel safe to be vulnerable, be ourselves, that's when we can be creative, passionate, contribute our best.
So embracing imperfection, it's about creating a sense of belonging. It is. When we embrace imperfection, we create a space where people can be themselves, make mistakes, and learn. That's where real innovation comes from.
This makes me think about giving and receiving feedback, which can be so tough, when we're trying to be perfect and avoid vulnerability.
Oh, good point. Brown actually dedicates part 7 to that, daring greatly in difficult conversations, including feedback.
Yeah.
She says giving and receiving feedback, it's essential for daring leadership. It lets us address issues directly, support growth, and keep those boundaries healthy.
I think a lot of people struggle with giving feedback. They don't want to hurt feelings or damage relationships.
It is vulnerable, right. But Brown says avoiding those conversations actually hurts more in the long run.
Right.
Problems grow, resentment builds, relationships break down.
So it's better to have those tough conversations, even if they're uncomfortable. It shows you care enough to be honest.
Exactly. And Brown gives tips for giving feedback like focusing on specific behaviors, not generalizing, being clear and direct, framing it as an opportunity for growth, not criticism.
She also talks about tone of voice and body language, right?
Yes.
And creating a safe space for the other person to share their side.
It's so important to be empathetic and respectful, Recognize that the other person has feelings too.
And receiving feedback can be just as tough, especially if we're not used to criticism or we take things personally.
Right. Brown says we should approach it with a growth mindset, see it as a chance to learn, stay open, curious, ask questions, and focus on the specific behaviors, not the other person's intentions.
I love her advice to take a deep breath and count to 10 before responding.
Especially when you feel defensive, right?
Yeah.
It helps you calm down, respond thoughtfully.
So having those tough conversations, giving and receiving feedback, it's about courage over comfort.
It is.
Stepping into vulnerability and having those conversations that ultimately make our relationships stronger.
Exactly. And Brown says these skills are important for everyone, not just leaders. Anyone who wants to build healthy relationships, at work and in life.
This reminds me of what we were talking about earlier, rumbling with vulnerability.
Oh, yeah, I see that.
Those difficult conversations, the feedback, those are the rumbles Brown talks about, right?
They are.
We're dealing with complex issues, challenging ideas, facing those uncomfortable truths.
And Brown says those rumbles are essential for growth and innovation because we move beyond just agreeing, superficially. We get to those underlying tensions, disagreements that can stop progress.
And actually says leaders need to show that they're willing to rumble.
Yes.
Show their team it's okay to disagree, to challenge things, and to have those tough conversations, but in a kind way.
And Brown talks about creating safe containers for those rumbles.
Right.
Spaces where people feel safe to share, without being judged.
That safety is so important for building trust, open communication. And Brown gives some tips for building those safe containers, right?
She does. Things like setting ground rules, establishing shared values, and creating that culture of respect and open communication.
She also talks about being aware of our own emotions, our reactions, and making it okay for people to disagree, to have different perspectives, even to get things wrong sometimes.
Because it's in those vulnerable, imperfect moments, right, that we build strong connections and create those really resilient teams.
This brings us to part 8, where Brown talks about shame and how it affects daring leadership.
Shame, it's something Brown has spent her whole career studying. She says shame is that feeling of believing you're flawed, unworthy of love and belonging.
It's that feeling of being inadequate, defective. It can be so crippling, especially for leaders.
Absolutely. Brown says shame is the biggest barrier to daring leadership. It stops us from being ourselves, from taking risks, from having those tough conversations that we need for growth and connection.
It makes sense. When we feel ashamed, we hide, we protect ourselves.
We do.
Makes it hard to be vulnerable, connect, lead with courage.
It does. And shame grows in secrecy and silence. The less we talk about it, the stronger it gets.
So how do we deal with shame, both in ourselves and in others?
Brown says the antidote to shame is empathy.
Okay.
That ability to understand and share the feelings of another person. She says it's crucial for building trust, connection, resilience, at work and in life.
I used to think empathy was something you either have or you don't.
Oh, interesting.
But Brown says it's a skill. You can learn it and practice it.
She's right. She outlines 4 key skills: perspective taking, staying out of judgment, recognizing emotions in others, and communicating that you see them.
So perspective taking, that's trying to see things from their point of view. And staying out of judgment, that's putting aside our own biases, just listening with an open mind.
Okay.
Recognizing emotions, that's paying attention to cues, both verbal and nonverbal, and communicating that recognition, letting them know we see how they're feeling.
Exactly. And Brown says mindfulness is the foundation. Without that awareness of our emotions and others' emotions, we miss those empathy cues.
Like offering sympathy instead of empathy, or trying to fix the problem instead of just listening.
Right. Brown says empathy isn't about fixing things or giving advice. It's about listening, acknowledging their emotions, and letting them know they're not alone.
One story that stuck with me about empathy was the one about Brown missing her daughter's field hockey game.
Oh, yeah.
She was so upset, feeling guilty, ashamed. But her friend Suzanne, instead of minimizing Brown's feelings, she just acknowledged them, saying, "My heart is breaking too."
Oh.
That simple statement, that shared pain, it created such a strong connection, much more powerful than any advice. Sometimes the best thing we can do is just be there with someone in their pain.
And Brown emphasizes that this empathy isn't about fixing or rescuing, just being present, offering support.
This makes me think about how often at work we try to avoid those tough conversations about shame and vulnerability. We try to ignore them, pretend they don't exist. But Brown says that just makes things worse.
She's all about normalizing those emotions, creating a culture where it's okay to talk about shame, fear, disappointment.
And she encourages leaders to be vulnerable themselves, share their own struggles, create that safe space for others to do the same.
Because in those vulnerable moments, right?
Yeah.
That's where we connect, build those strong, resilient teams.
So addressing shame at work,
yeah,
it's about creating that culture of empathy, compassion.
Exactly. And Brown gives tips, like being mindful of our language, really listening, and creating opportunities for people to share their stories safely.
One of the most powerful things we can do as leaders is just be present, listen without judgment, and offer support without trying to fix everything.
Absolutely. And Brown says it's not about being perfect or knowing everything. It's about showing up authentically with empathy and a willingness to learn and grow with your team.
This leads us to part 9, revolutionizing the way we lead, where Brown challenges us to rethink those traditional leadership models, embrace a more daring approach.
One thing she emphasizes is moving away from scarcity and fear toward abundance and trust.
I've seen those scarcity-based cultures where it's all about competition, hoarding resources, being afraid to take risks. It's not very inspiring.
Brown says those cultures are rooted in fear,
Right.
fear of not having enough, not being enough, losing what you have. That fear leads to those self-sabotaging behaviors like hoarding information, resisting change, undermining each other.
So how do we shift to an abundance mindset?
Brown says it starts with recognizing and challenging those scarcity beliefs we might have, questioning those assumptions about ourselves, others, and the world.
She talks about gratitude, focusing on what we have, not what we lack, and being generous, sharing our resources, knowledge, our time.
And one powerful way to cultivate abundance is to focus on strength in ourselves and in others. When we focus on strengths, we create a positive environment. People feel valued.
And that leads to more engagement, motivation, people getting things done.
Absolutely. Brown also emphasizes creating a culture of learning and growth, where it's safe to experiment, take risks, make mistakes.
She says in a learning culture, mistakes are seen as opportunities, not failures.
Exactly. And she wants leaders to model that growth mindset, be willing to learn from their own mistakes, ask for help, and create a space where feedback is a good thing, not a threat.
It sounds like creating that culture of abundance and trust requires a whole new way of thinking about leadership, moving away from control and hierarchy towards collaboration and empowerment.
Absolutely. Brown says daring leadership is about creating a space where everyone feels valued, respected, empowered to contribute.
It's not about the leader as the hero, the one with all the answers. It's about collaboration, vulnerability, learning, and growing together.
And she emphasizes that it's not about being perfect or knowing everything. It's about showing up authentically with integrity and a willingness to learn.
It's about vulnerability, courage, empathy, using those to create a more compassionate and courageous world.
And speaking of a courageous world, one of the most important tools Brown gives us for living our values is operationalizing them,
Right, turning them into actions.
Yeah.
It's not enough to just say our values. We need to figure out what they look like in our everyday lives. And Brown has this fun metaphor for it. The values operationalizator.
A little silly, but it works.
It does.
She wants us to get specific about how our values show up in our actions.
Okay.
Like if one of your values is courage, what does that look like at work, with your colleagues? How do you show courage when you have a tough decision to make?
I love how Brown breaks it down step by step, giving us examples, helping us really understand our values and how to live them out authentically.
And she also says it's important to have a support system to keep us accountable, especially when things get tough.
And that's where permission slips come in.
Oh, right.
Brown says we should find those people in our lives who support us being brave and ask them for permission to show up in a way that matches our values.
It's such a great idea. We don't have to do it alone, Having support can make all the difference.
And as leaders, one of the most important things we can do is create that same support for our team. It's about a culture where vulnerability is good, mistakes are for learning, and people can be themselves.
And being willing to model those behaviors ourselves, show our team it's okay to ask for help, admit we don't know something, and embrace the messy, imperfect process of learning.
This conversation has been so rich, so nuanced. Dare to lead. It's about so much more than just leadership. It's about living a more wholehearted, courageous life in every way.
I completely agree. Brown's work connects with people so deeply because it's about those universal things: vulnerability, shame, courage, belonging. And her research gives us such a strong way to understand those things and how to navigate them with more skill, more compassion. So we were talking about how Brown's message really goes beyond just the workplace, right?
It does. It feels like Dare to Lead encourages us to show up authentically everywhere, not just at work.
Exactly. It's about embracing vulnerability, having the courage to be ourselves, and building those connections, in every part of our lives.
One thing I found really helpful was the part about recognizing and dealing with shame, not just in ourselves, but in, the whole culture around us.
That's such a big part of Brown's work.
It is.
She says shame is that painful feeling of believing you're flawed, unworthy, You're not good enough, not worthy of love. And she argues that shame is like this huge force in our society.
It's interesting, right? Shame is not something we talk about openly a lot.
We don't.
But you can feel its impact everywhere.
It's true. Shame thrives when it's in and when we don't talk about it. It hides behind perfectionism, people-pleasing, judgment, and it can show up in all sorts of ways, like withdrawing from people, getting angry, or numbing ourselves with, substances or distractions.
So how do we fight shame both in ourselves and in, the bigger picture?
Brown has some great strategies. First, we need to be brave enough to actually talk about shame. When we brought out in the open and share our stories, it loses its power. Second, we need empathy and compassion for ourselves and for others. When we can see each other with understanding and kindness, shame can't grow. And finally, we need vulnerability. Showing up authentically with all our flaws sends the message that shame doesn't control us.
Brown also talks about spotting shame in the cultures we're part of, right?
Yes.
What are some signs that shame might be at play in, say, a workplace or even a family?
Brown gives a whole list of behaviors to look out for. Things like perfectionism, playing favorites, gossiping, backstabbing, comparing ourselves to others, tying our worth to how productive we are, harassment, discrimination, power struggles, bullying, blaming, teasing, and cover-ups.
That's a lot, and it shows how sneaky shame can be.
It is.
It can be subtle, like constantly comparing or feeling like our worth depends on how much we get done.
Right. And it can be more obvious, too, like bullying. The important thing is to be aware of it and create a culture where shame is acknowledged and dealt with in a healthy way.
So how do we build a culture that's resilient to shame?
Brown says it starts with creating a space where vulnerability is a good thing, something we celebrate. When we encourage people to be themselves, to share their struggles, their imperfections, we make it harder for shame to take hold. It's also important to model empathy and compassion. When leaders show those qualities, it sets the tone for the whole organization.
And she talks about clear communication, healthy boundaries, right? When everyone knows what's expected and they feel safe to speak up, shame is less likely to become a problem.
Absolutely. And one of the most powerful things we can do is encourage people to share their stories. When we create that safe space to talk about experiences with shame, we take away its power and start to heal and connect.
It's interesting how so many of these things we've talked about are connected. Vulnerability, trust, empathy, shame, resilience, they all work together.
It's true. That's what's so great about Brown's work. She shows us that being a daring leader isn't about separate traits. It's about a whole way of being, a wholehearted and courageous way of being.
One of the big takeaways from Dare to Lead is that daring leadership isn't about being perfect or knowing everything. It's about being okay with being vulnerable, building trust, being curious, being okay with discomfort, and showing up with empathy and compassion for ourselves and for others.
Exactly. It's about choosing courage over comfort, about being brave enough to face our fears, even when we don't know what will happen. It's about knowing we're all human, we all mess up, and it's okay to ask for help.
It feels like Dare to Lead is more than just a book about leadership, It's about how to live a more wholehearted, more courageous life in all parts of our lives.
I completely agree. It's like a call to action, inviting us to be ourselves, to embrace our imperfections, and to be daring in everything we do.
And with that, we've come to the end of our deep dive into Brené Brown's Dare to Lead.
We hope you found this discussion helpful and inspiring. Maybe it's given you some new ideas for your own leadership journey.
If you want to learn more about Brené Brown's work, check out her website at brenebrown.com.
There's tons of stuff there. Articles, videos, podcasts, even online courses.
And remember, daring leadership isn't about reaching a destination. It's a journey.
It is.
It's about those choices we make every day. Choosing courage over comfort, vulnerability over perfection, connection over being alone.
So what will you bear to do today?